Today's dialogue will focus on reflecting on instances of bias at Dominican based on various identity markers. It is important to recognize when instances of hate and bias occur in our classrooms, in our teams, in our residence halls, in our student groups, and in all other aspects of our work, including physical and virtual spaces. The first step to combating bias is to recognize behaviors and policies as hateful and/or discriminatory. We will also highlight the multiple efforts that promote a safe and inclusive campus climate. We hope to move past recognition of bias and to commit to taking action to actively combating any behavior that is not in line with DU values of inclusion. With that, I invite Dr. Sheila Radford Hill to share a context on how DU has addressed bias incidents and promoted diversity, equity, and inclusion education.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about a couple of things that we should be aware of. And I want to start by saying, as people continue to enter the waiting room, that what I'm about to say is, it's on our website. We plan to update it. We plan to continue to talk about it. So I think that although this is the first conversation, it won't be the last conversation. There is bias at Dominican, but there's equity at Dominican. I think that's very important, that we can use the equity that's here and the commitment to equity to eliminate the negative and harmful effects of bias. So I'm going to talk about what is bias, and basically bias is this idea of a preference. It's in favor or really against a thing, a group, or a person. And there are several types of bias. So, and there are lots of different types, but they come in a couple of categories. Implicit or unconscious bias is the one that we're referring to right now. There is, of course, explicit bias, which is really discriminatory behavior and harm that we intend to do people because of their race, background, religion, color, sexual orientation, gender, disability, ethnicity, race, etc. But I'm talking now about implicit or unconscious bias, not the deliberate acts that we do to discriminate against someone, but the acts that we do that we are not aware of that affect others in a negative way. The picture that you see here is just one of many sites. This one is from Ohio State University, and I encourage you to go to Ohio State University site, look at their implicit bias reviews. They have a number of YouTube videos. They have a number of studies, and you can do your homework on implicit bias at this one site. We say at Dominican that we do not discriminate, that we do not tolerate acts of hate speech that intimidate, target, or demean others, that we treat victims, survivors with compassion, that we actively protect and promote a climate of trust and safety for everyone. We say we commit to a set of core values. We say those values are civility, respect, and caring. We say we investigate incidents of bias. These sayings, what we say, are enshrined in our policies and are there for our community and the general public to read. That's what we say. What sometimes happens, though, is that we don't always live up to what we say. And as a demonstration of that, I'm just showing the one process complaints that we've had since 2014, when the one process system came into being. And you can look, I've broken this down by bias, gender-based misconduct, sexual misconduct, and I've totaled it up. So altogether, since 2014, One Process has received and worked to resolve 189 complaints and 33 reports that have not resulted in complaints. This says to me that there is bias on our campus, that people are harmed, that they are concerned, and that they do complain. So what can we do about bias? How do we get the campus climate we deserve? So we're working on a few projects that students have helped us think through and supported us in Information League, which is providing training to faculty, students, and staff at no cost to us so that we can introduce ourselves to a real understanding of bias and how it works and how we can mitigate it. Also, EverFi, which is our training provider that has done our Title IX training. Last year, we purchased a diversity and inclusion suite and a mitigating bias course. And we hope to implement those this year. And then when in conjunction with the AAC&U, the Association for American Colleges and Universities, we have become a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center, which is kind of a virtual center to build relationships for racial equity and to conduct racial healing circles on our campus. And then finally, since we're going to talk about being a bystander and upstander, I just want to say a bystander is somebody who's there is doing during a potentially harmful incident, but does nothing to intervene. Sometimes that's the effect of something called bystander effect, meaning the presence of others keeps us from acting, so we all stand around and just look at someone being bullied or harmed. An upstander speaks or takes action in support of an individual, particularly when a person is being attacked or manipulated into a dangerous situation. Upstanders should intervene carefully, but they should intervene. They should act. They can distract. They can de-escalate. They can redirect. They can remove people from the situation. They can check to see if someone needs help. They can call for help, etc. So that's what I have to say about bias. And I know we'll talk about it in our chat rooms.
Thank you so much for that, Sheila. So now I'm going to invite some student leaders who have agreed to share their personal experiences and some opening statements. So we'll go in order. First, Lauren Berger, then Carlos Benitez, and then Brian Cafunia.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So like Jackie said, my name is Lauren Berger. So this is my statement. Over the years, Dominican University has worked tirelessly to implement many diversity and inclusion initiatives throughout our campus. I believe these initiatives have ensured that most students feel welcome and safe when they walk onto DU's campus, but for some students, this may not be the case. Today, I want to discuss the issues of racism involving some of our student athletes and the issues of racialized spaces on campus. I first want to start by saying I am not a student athlete, but my peers and I have experienced instances of hate and bias from specific student athletes on our campus. And I believe in order for change to occur, we must first start by having these difficult and uncomfortable conversations. Throughout my time at DU, I have witnessed and heard of countless times of racial slurs, such as the N-word, being used by certain student athletes on a specific team. I have also seen the aftermath of destruction of posters in the residence hall by these student athletes that uplift and bring light to African American history and Black voices on our campus. I believe our student athletes are leaders on this campus, and with such a high standard to uphold comes a lot of responsibility. I have not seen much action taken with these instances of hate, but my wish is that these athletes are held accountable. Our campus, city, and world should not be a place of hate, but in order for this to happen, we must start with our own self-reflection. I ask that all student athletes, white, Black, Latinx, take time to reflect on how they may have been hateful in the past. And I think now more than ever is a time for us to all educate ourselves and start actively being anti-racist in our everyday lives. I also want to touch on the subject of racialized places we see on our campus, and this especially pertains to the residence halls. As a former resident student, I can attest to this scenario. There's an idea in residence hall life that Murray Hall is seen as the gated community because of its newer upgrades and higher living prices, while Power and Coghlan are often seen as the ghetto or the projects because it's cheaper and doesn't have as many upgrades as Murray. I can admit that during my time in the residence halls, I've been a part of using this language. We have to ensure that one, all students feel as though their needs are being met in all areas of campus, and two, that the language we use is not bringing us together as a community instead of dividing us. I ask all members of the Dominican community to take a look at the spaces which they are a part of. Is there diversity? Is the space welcoming to students of all backgrounds? And what type of students are normally in these spaces? Today, I hope this dialogue allows us to step outside of our comfort zones, reflect on our past mistakes and faults, and actively work towards making Dominican a place for all students to feel welcome and invited. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Carlos Beitas, and I'll be talking about the LGBTQ community on campus. For many LGBTQ people like me, college is a long-awaited safe haven. Far from queerphobia and transphobia of small towns, high schools, and close-minded families. We come to college to find refuge from the hate that has followed us since our hips swayed the wrong way, since our voices pitched too high or too low, and since we traded dolls for cars or cars for dolls. Every so often, I walked on the hall of Lewis and holding hands with my boyfriend, and were met with glaring stares from staff, faculty, and students. An unforgiving stare that reminds us that our love is not yet welcomed or accepted yet on this campus, regardless of the fact that we preach Caritas throughout. I, like many queers on this campus, have learned that Caritas is conditional on whether you pass as unproblematic to the heteronormative eye. Trans students are misgendered and erased every day, and no one bats an eye. Gender-inclusive bathrooms are rare and hidden throughout campus. Administration has asked about the respectability of drag on campus because in their eyes, there is no respectability in drag. We ask students to bring themselves, but not all of themselves, because we cannot handle our students' queer and gender non-conforming bodies, on top of the fact that many of them have Black and brown skin. We do not challenge homophobia, queerphobia, and transphobia on this campus because we excuse it as a difference of opinion. We rely on our queer students to house each other quietly in common ground, to create home for each other, and we never once consider the fact that they have never had home where they came from. We ask them to build community from nothing on this campus with minimal support and have the audacity to ask why they fail. As we propel ourselves to combat racism within ourselves and within this institution, we must remind each other that racism does not exist in a vacuum. It lays alongside its siblings, queerphobia, transphobia, and sexism. I urge Dominican to begin by revisiting its policies and explicitly and clearly condone homophobia and transphobia. Second, I urge the Multicultural Center and this campus to begin recognizing and celebrating LGBTQ History Month in October, the same month we celebrate National Coming Out Day. We must fight to create spaces and policies for queer people on this campus, because for too many of us, the U is not a home. It is simply where we live, eat, and study. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brian Kafunya, and I wanted to share kind of my thoughts on this. I think it goes without saying that we're living in the midst of some pretty challenging times. There was a seismic rejection of the status quo. The world is changing, culture is changing, and it looks like there's a real opportunity to foment positive change. But the reality, I think, is like positive change isn't positive for everybody. And it's hard, it's not immediate, you know? And sometimes we want to be on the right side of things. We feel in our hearts and in our heads that this is the right thing to do, but we still have those our own little reservations, right? Our own, well, I'll support baby not to this length or go this far. And I found it to be complex, especially when we're talking about social norms and behavior modification. A lot of things forcing me to unlearn some of the things that I thought were concrete. And I was struggling. For example, I'm a Black man, that's obvious, right? But I'm also an immigrant. And so I'm sensitive to the microaggressions, and I know all about discrimination, or so I thought, right? And then I realized that my status as a male in a patriarchal society gives me a privilege over my sister, over my mother, that I didn't feel right, right? Like, wait, what do you mean? Like, I get more than them, or and I have an easier time doing something. That's not true. I work just as hard. And then I'm having conversations with some of my white friends trying to explain, like, it's hard for people of color, for immigrants to do. They say the same thing to me, and it hit me. Oh, like this is deep. This isn't just my own experience, and I'm not alone in this. And we all come to these conversations from different perspectives. And it's a hard pill to swallow that I was complicit, because private memories, private recollections of my own bias start to come to the forefront of my mind. And I start to question my own sincerity and my own authenticity. But in having conversations to prepare for this conversation, for this dialogue, Jackie said something that wasn't targeted to me, but it freed me, and which was basically that there's no expectation of perfection, but there's a responsibility to do better. And I've been thinking a lot, because not only is there, because there's a saying, right, that it costs $0 to be a good person, but I don't know if that's really true, because sometimes you pay a social price. Sometimes it might be being in college and looking at somebody who's offering you a scholarship, but they're saying certain things, and you don't know. You're in that moment where you have to choose between your own self-respect and some of these other things that might advance your life, right? Which, as Carlos kind of mentioned, college is this time to figure that out. And I've been complicit in taking that from other people. And I guess basically what I'm trying to say is that approaching these conversations, there's a lot that we don't say, right? There's a lot that we're not honest about. And as Dr. Redford Hill said, Dominican has these standards, but there's still bias, there's still gridlock, there's still tension. So what's it gonna take? Well, I don't know. I'm gonna be honest, I don't have the answers. But I will say that it does take some bravery, because there's no room for ego. And you learn that pretty quickly. It's not about me. It's not about you, right? You don't get a cookie for it. But we do have a responsibility to do the work, because the fruit is ripe, right? And there might be times where, like, it feels the fruit is too out of reach, or we don't have the tools, and what can I do? Or maybe I'll just stay in my corner and let somebody who knows a little bit more be an advocate, or let somebody else say something. But I've found that sometimes we end up just letting the fruit rot, So I guess what I'm saying is that in my own experience, I found that tension, right, of understanding and being a recipient of discrimination, but also of being a facilitator of it. And it's hard. It's hard because you have to have those honest conversations with yourself. But I think that's part of this dialogue. That's part of growing as a community. That's part of making the change. That's part of working towards it. And I just want to encourage everybody, because in my own experience, I've been encouraged by my community and people like Jackie to remind me, yo, this isn't that easy. So be brave.
Thank you, Lauren, Carlos, and Brian, for those really vulnerable and brave statements. So now I'm going to invite all of us to join a group. So our wonderful intern, Suli, is going to divide us all into 4 different groups, and we will have a facilitator for each of our discussions. And in the chat box, you will see the questions in advance. So happy dialoguing. Well, I hope you all enjoyed your dialogues. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Statement, as you all take a look at some artwork that one of our very own students, Diona Rafi, class of 21, she's an intern for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. She made this poster for Juneteenth, and it's a quote by Ai Weiwei in the book Humanity. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I hope you had a productive dialogue in your small groups and that you feel inspired by what you heard today. Dominican has a history of educating students from historically marginalized backgrounds, and there have been several initiatives implemented to promote diversity and inclusion. Yet, as you heard today, there continues to be a hostile climate for some students more than others. I call all of us to be held accountable for not only creating policies and statements that promote inclusion, but to actively implement these policies and live out our Dominican values of social justice. We must do so collaboratively by 1, recognizing our own privilege, 2, being willing to be vulnerable and humble enough to admit we need to keep listening and learning, and 3, stepping up and being brave in difficult moments. Our students and colleagues from historically marginalized backgrounds do not need us to give them a voice because they've always had a very strong one. Instead, as allies to communities for which we do not belong to, we need to be willing to listen even when it is painful and to commit to being active accomplices in the fight against hate and bias. I commend all of you for joining this dialogue today and for any work you have been involved in to improve the campus climate at DU. Ultimately, a safe campus benefits all of us, including our mental health, productivity levels, and overall satisfaction with DU. I invite you to continue engaging in dialogue and interrupting all forms of bias and discrimination in your own spheres of influence. And before I close out, I'd like to read the quote, and then I'm gonna give Carlos just a few seconds to share a course that he is creating. Freedom is not an absolute condition, but a result of resistance.
Looking back at the Title IX training that has been implemented over the years, I've actually adapted a course to be directly impacting students, right, to take ownership of sexism and the issues concerning sexual assault and sexual assault prevention. So I've adapted a course alongside Zachary Draves, who is here today. And I would like to invite you to invite students to that course as we seek, right, to empower young people on this campus to intercept, right, to become upstanders against sexual assault, rape, and sexism. I'll send you an invitation later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.